exists already since 1981, and it's published 2 times a year, at least 2 times a year. Each issue is thematic in its nature, and it forms its own project. For example, recent issues have been devoted to the work of James Sterling, to public places, to criticism, to architectural models, to architecture exhibitions, to the medium-sized city, to the question, what is good architecture, to the building of atmosphere in collaboration with Peter Zumthor. And during the last 2 years, codes and continuities, elaborating on different traditions in architecture and the making of a public landscape. Now, Oase draws interest from all over Europe and beyond. It's bilingual and it has an international orientation. Simultaneously, it's very strongly rooted or anchored in the Low Countries of Flanders and the Netherlands. And Oase is a scientific journal equipped with a scientific board and a peer review system. It balances between theory and practice with an editorial board consisting of 10 people from the academic world, education, and practice environments. And Oase embraces the infinite, timeless themes, you could say, and this makes the journal just the opposite of most conventional magazines, focusing on contemporary themes. So the typology of Oase in the field of publications can best be marked as a journal of neither. It's neither a magazine, neither a book, it's neither academic only, neither completely practice related. Thank you.
The issue on the work of OMA during the first decade was edited by Véronique Patteeuw and myself, and it's actually a very monographic, very elementary monographic issue, focusing on the architecture of OMA and on the role of Rem Koolhaas as an architect, so not basically on the writings or the biography. We simply started from the list of projects that is on the website of OMA, beginning in 1978 and ending in 1989. And the so-called first decade of the office during this interval of 10 years. 42 projects were developed, 15 of them here in bold were actually executed. And then we made a double invitation for authors who were interested in contributing. Either they could write about one project, a shorter critical text, or they could devote a longer essay to one technique or one architectural theme in a longer essay a longer essay devoted to a technique during this period. So the result was 16 texts, 6 essays based on one architectural theme, 10 critiques of specific projects or buildings. And as a sort of epilogue to the issue, we collected what you could call OMA cover shoots from the era. So there is a quite surprising amount of magazines that have put in between 1987 and 1989 projects of OMA on the cover. I suggest that we talk about architecture and by means of talking about projects, and maybe we can begin with the very first project in the project chronology on the website of OMA, which is the project for the Dutch Parliament extension in The Hague. You could call it a very brutal project in the sense that it presented a very clear cut towards the existing historical city. And as such, it was, I guess, polemically intended against the visions or the opinions at the time, considering the European city and the conservation of sort of pseudo-fictional historical city.
I think I should give a kind of short description of my mood considering looking back at this particular period. I'm typically uncomfortable with looking back, although I do it all the time, but I don't particularly like it when other people do it. But I decided to surrender completely to your intentions and to be as precise and creative as I can be in this condition. But maybe one thing is critical to say before we kind of genuinely start. You already used the word brutal once, and I'm sure that there will be many other brutals. Well, one of the things which I would like to ask your attention for is that you probably will be astonished as contemporary and presumably youngish architects by the brutality of some of the material and by the kind of unfinished nature of many of the representations. And you will probably also be astonished how one could build a career based on such seemingly rough givens or rough production. And to make the kind of situation even more complex to understand, I want to emphasize only one aspect, which is that being born in 44, we are talking about the beginning of a career that started almost when I was kind of 38, 39. So simply to make a simple comparison, all this work was done by, all these beginnings were made by somebody who was as old then as Björke Ingels is now. And I think what I want to kind of suggest is how at the time there was a complete lack of sophistication in terms of kind of representation and a complete lack of smoothness, which nevertheless did not interfere with the idea of kind of building a career. And maybe we should kind of really talk about this lack of smoothness also and compare it to the current situation. What was your question about this project?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that by calling this brutal, it was really a heartfelt compliment in regards to the project. Because you can compare it with contemporary projects on the city, which were much more historicist and in a way fictional or
well, I think the question is interesting. At the time, and that was kind of part of a brief conversation we had as an introduction of here, anyone who produced a piece of architecture felt themselves kind of surrounded by architectural positions. In other words, you would not innocently kind of commit to an idea, but you would be aware that that idea was something defined in relationship to a number of then current architectural ideologies. So if you would kind of work in the context of the historical city, as this was in The Hague, you would be aware that there was a strong position articulated by the brothers Krier among them and by postmodernists in general that kind of basically kind of suggested that in the center city you needed to conform to the morphology of that central city. So that was one ideology. There was a second ideology that was a more formalistic ideology surrounding, concentrated on Colin Rowe. And that was an ideology that suggested that in particular context needed to be the kind of thing that inspired and that dictated your kind of project. And if you worked in Holland, you were also surrounded by the ideology of Forum Group, Aldo van Eyck, Hertzberger and co. And that kind of suggested that kind of basically, even if you had a kind of very large architectural kind of project with many square meters, you needed to kind of subdivide it in smaller components and create a kind of pattern between those components to show the kind of, I'm trying not to caricature any of these ideas, to show the kind of interaction and the kind of human activity in the fault lines of that geometry. And maybe it's important that I'm not trying to caricature these positions, because actually to be surrounded like that was very inspiring. Even if you completely disagreed, it was inspiring to know that each architecture project was a kind of careful navigation between different positions. And I felt that in each case we had to kind of present our project as a position between these ideologies. So in that sense, yes, the project was brutal, but in a way the brutality was kind of very managed, because what we discovered is that, of course, this is a kind of historical complex, that actually the historicity of each of these elements was kind of highly dubious. We reconstructed the kind of history of their construction and of their kind of very frequent renovations. For instance, here there was a kind of complete 19th century interior kind of embedded in a seemingly kind of old project. And what we discovered is that here there were kind of simply new constructions that were in a kind of fake historical style. So we very selectively eliminated that fake historical style and then claimed a presence in this ring surrounding the Ridderzaal, claimed a presence for the kind of modern time. And so, yes, on one way it was brutal and perhaps shocking that we eliminated something, but what we eliminated was fake and therefore intellectually not credible. And therefore, when 30 years later or 25 years later, we were interested in preservation and tried to discover in preservation perhaps a significant new terrain for the architect or a new way of working in preservation. We also presented this project as a kind of preservation project. So it's a project you can read in two ways, either as a breach, as we called it then, of modernity in a historical wall, or on the other hand, as a preservation of a very complex interlocking of different preservation methods.
So you were in conversation with these other positions at that time. Is there someone specifically who you were in conversation with?
I wrote an article kind of afterwards, and kind of in that article I kind of really explained how this kind of project related to specifically Row, Career, and Forum. So I made it in that particular case really as explicit as I could make it, as a kind of intention to entertain a communication with them.
I have another more factual question. This is indeed on the website of OMA, the very first project. Well, actually, if I'm correct, OMA was established in 1975. Do you consider this really the beginning of the office, this project?
No, and I think OMA was a kind of, or is, or was a kind of group of architects that got together in 72. My teacher at the time at the Architecture Association, Ilias Engelis, asked whether he could participate in a competition that I had started. Then we worked with our wives on a kind of project that eventually was Exodus, or the Voluntary Prisoners of Architecture. And so basically you could say that during the 70s we were constantly kind of testing different vocabularies, different forms of representation, different degrees of utopianism or kind of realism. So we really used the 70s to test a lot of potential ways of being an architect, and then at the end of the 70s, we felt ripe to really become and do architecture. So this was the first project where Ilias and Gillis, and at that time our brief partner for 4 months, Diet, made a serious effort to actually make the transition to real architecture. So it's not the beginning of the office, but the articulation of a transition.
Okay. So there was a sort of 0 decade before the first decade, in a sense. Yeah. Okay. Can we go on to the next project? So these are other. This is actually what ended up as the extension of the.
I think it's kind of really interesting to see how confused architecture typically is, because this was a kind of project that was supposed to be kind of much more sensitive, but actually you can see it's enormous and amorphous, and here it leaves this kind of piece as kind of tokenism, and therefore I would say is maybe forced to launch all its formalism in this phase, and I think that is, you know, one of the recurrent problems of architecture, that is the kind of primitivity of the kind of public discourse that is actually, of course, very hard to overcome with subtlety as an architect.
Okay. No, maybe I should inform the audience who don't know the name of the architect. It's Piet de Bruin. At the beginning of the 80s, OMA started working at a quite large project on social housing, the air plan, and I think construction was finished at the end of 88, so it sort of spans the entire first decade. In a way, this you can read this project as a sort of almost a sort of recycling of types or typologies and forms from the modern movement. Is that true?
Well, I think you basically. At the beginning of the 80s, I was in the following situation. The reason to become an architect was very directly triggered by modern architecture, and in my case, particularly by Soviet avant-gardism of the 20s. Then I kind of looked at New York and wrote a book about American modernism as, to some extent, the kind of realization of that dream, and so that I was completely indoctrinated and deeply influenced and explicitly influenced by modernism, and of course that was not a very comfortable situation, because it's embarrassing if you're ambitious. That the sources of your inspiration are so kind of visible, so tangible, and that you therefore cannot claim any originality. At the same time, I was a kind of puritanical Dutch person, or Calvinistic Dutch person, and therefore have a reticence about modernity or about originality, and I wanted to be only as original as I needed to be, or only as original as kind of relevant in particular cases. So you can read the entire 10 years of this period as, on the one hand, a struggle to outrun the influence of, and the very tangible or blatant influence of early modernism, and on the other hand, as a kind of breaking position to not be too blatantly original. So in this case, if you also combine that kind of situation with the incredible complexity of getting work, which at that time and in this particular case was unbelievably complex because we were kind of parachuted by an Amsterdam wethouder inside a group of complete amateurs and bewoners or inhabitants that had the right to determine what happened there. So we needed to urgently find, kind of from the experience of kind of writing intellectual books, we were parachuted in the kind of most basic populist environment where we had to argue for certain kind of options. So mostly it was a kind of didactic effort, the quotation of elements. We had to educate that group, or we thought we had to educate that group in a kind of record time in at least being conversant and having an insight in what could happen on such a place. So that was the main kind of reason why we used the kind of existing repertoire as a kind of form of communication.
Was this also
Can you go back to the plan,
Yeah.
maybe?
Was this also a moment where postmodernism already was available in the Netherlands? So was there?
Well, I think the problem of the Netherlands is that postmodernism never happened here. And that is a kind of real problem because it meant that modernism had to become the postmodernism of Holland. And I think the Dutch are kind of very proud that they were resistant to postmodernism, but I think it's actually a serious flaw and lack of intellectual curiosity that phase bypassed us.
There's a contribution in the issue of Oase by Patteeuw entitled The Copy-Paste Decade.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's a heartfelt compliment from his side, but I think he describes also the airplane project as a kind of project that is the result of a sort of copy-paste.
Yeah. It was, but the copy-paste strategy was kind of really, in part, a didactic tool. And I have mixed feelings when I look at it. I think it's kind of really only the opening of this element and the kind of relationship to the existing kind of buildings of Meeuwen, which is, by the way, one of the kind of very many incredibly contextual dimensions of our work, which is successful. So at least we were able to convince that population of that against their initial claims against the kind of city, against basically everything. And for me it was a kind of very interesting moment, not so much in terms of the kind of confrontation with postmodernism, but more that, of course, if we talk about this decade, we are also talking about the beginning of neoliberalism, and therefore the beginning of the effect of the market economy. And this project started when the market economy was really a remote system on the horizon. The city of Amsterdam was firmly in socialist hands. Jan Schaefer was an icon of kind of socialism on a motorcycle and t-shirts, kind of socialist Hell's Angel who supported us incredibly. And of course the paradox that when this ended, it seemed to be completely alien to the market economy of the time. So in that sense, it started with a kind of nostalgic rehearsal of many precedents, and it ended as an inappropriate to the market economy kind of remnant of an earlier political system. Which now looks extremely touching and to some extent compelling for that reason.
Mm-hmm. This is a project that I think the initiative was also taken by a politician, or you were invited by a wethouder from Rotterdam. one of the interesting things here, I think you once called it our first retroactive project, in the sense that the story or the history or the narrative that is being told about this project is almost as important as the design itself.
Yes. Basically, because I had kind of written a book about New York that was well received in abroad. I had two sensational kind of moments that have never recurred. The Amsterdam wethouder asked me to do a project in Amsterdam, and Hans Mentink, the wethouder then of finance and architecture, asked me, sitting in front of a map of Rotterdam, where do you want to build? And basically, I was overwhelmed, but at the same time skeptical, and so therefore decided not to go for the, let's say, the most blatant or the largest or the most important site, but actually took a site that barely existed here. It kind of it was not even officially considered a site by the city. And that I did that because I thought that would give me time to develop something, and that kind of by working on something that was not considered desirable by other people, I might actually kind of pull it off. What interested me here is that since it was next to a bridge, and a bridge that kind of for political reasons was a very bizarre bridge, that basically approached the river, then deviated, and then crossed the river and went back again. A typical compromise of the 80s. That path or that trajectory also set up a unique situation in terms of looking at this site and therefore at this building. Because in the beginning you would see it in all its width. When you were here, it was almost like an eclipse, and then you moved away from it, and then here it unfolded itself again. So you see this sequence here, and the building was designed to make this sequence kind of particularly interesting. So in that sense, again, a work about context, and almost exclusively about context. And for me, very surprising that we are still considered in many cases to be anti-contextual. Since the site was almost non-existent, we also needed to kind of find a way to increase the volume, and that explains these kind of towers that are kind of falling out. As a kind of personal anecdote, our office was here. My office was, at the time, was kind of on the 7th floor. And so I had the privilege of seeing from my office a building by another architect, a white building, kind of emerge and kind of block my view of Rotterdam. But I think, on the other hand, that the Rotterdam, the building we eventually kind of built there, owes a lot to that building.
Mm-hmm. What would you see as differences or similarities between these projects?
I think the difference. The difference is, of course, initiative. As I said, the kind of situation where a politician asks you where do you want to build is typically not a situation from the market economy. It's a situation where there is a public sector that kind of can decide how things work, what goes where, that has the kind of interest to ask you what you think could be there. And here we were in a kind of radically different situation. This was a kind of market party that essentially wanted a sort of mix of housing, office and hotel, but never was quite sure what mix of which component was the right one. And so in the end, this kind of building is, that explains the building or the configuration of the building. In the end, we were kind of forced to consider each element a block and create a concept where each block could be kind of replaced by other blocks. And so it's kind of really an image of the imprecision or instability of market demand.
And that was also happening? No, that was not happening in the
that happened
project.
maybe 20 years later.
Yeah.
You could also wonder if there's another drawing from the Boompjes project in which you can clearly see almost a sort of historical battlefield of approaches to the city, actually to the destroyed city of Rotterdam. You have the, at the time I think quite new pencil buildings from Piet Blom, but also modernist post-war projects, post-modernist 70s projects. So maybe there is a sort of extreme density of context that is not present in the project for the Rotterdam nowadays.
It was incredibly suggestive for me because this was kind of first skyscraper even in Europe, built in the 1870s, I think, and then Piet Blom, the kind of humanist kind of phase of the kind of city of Rotterdam. So there were all these clues together kind of focused on one particular site. But if I really worked on it, I could show the Rotterdam in a kind of equally complex kind of environment. There's the Ben van Berkel Bridge, and so there are kind of many similar.
A project from 1982 was the competition for Parc de la Villette, which was in the end won by Bernard Tschumi. I think this is one of the projects in which there is a sort of, well, I was thinking that, I think in his text on the Eiffel Tower, Roland Barthes says that architecture is something that is always, in a boring way, very functional, but that is also something, it's always also trying to do something impossible. And maybe the impossible aspect in this project is already present in the brief, in the sense that it is a sort of extreme combination of all kinds of activities, which makes this park, well, maybe no longer a park as a sort of resting place, but a sort of very frenetic, well, landscape of activities. So I wonder if you consider this a project that is both a sort of maybe an exaggeration of the brief of the client, but also a sort of critique of his, well, let's call it strange or somewhat far-fetched ambitions.
No, it was definitely not a critique, and I'm kind of happy that you kind of raised this issue of critique, because as you kind of probably know, I think that architecture can be critical, but I don't think it can be a critique of the subject or that it embodies, because there is something inherently affirmative about architecture. But maybe we can talk about that later. But here, and my political explanation is not a kind of form of convenience, but it simply is, I want to, if I look at the decade kind of in retrospect, it's really the decade where the kind of struggle between socialism, or rather the social or the public, and the market is raising its head, and that therefore there's almost not a single project which cannot be read on those terms, and also which shouldn't be read on those terms, because here this was Pierre Mauroy, the very socialist mayor of Lille, was prime minister at the time of the Mitterrand government, and they, I think it was launched in, what is the date, 81?
81.
So it was in the beginning of the 80s, an extremely kind of charged and entirely socialistic kind of program was launched. And so, and this program was so ambitious that, and you kind of referred to that, that there was more program than site, and so that in a certain way, there couldn't be a park on the same site where they wanted a park. And that is also what you kind of see here. Oh, can you go back to that?
Yeah. It's if you push on one of the arrows to the left or to the right.
And that is why you see this diagram kind of simply in here. Sorry. So what we needed to, what we did in this case, kind of we organized a program, and each of these was kind of something that they asked for, an activity or sports or etc. Across the site in bands, and we created a park system in between those bands, simply on lines. There was only room for lines, and so that almost like a Dutch landscapes, you never see thickness of a row of trees, but always kind of coulisses of trees. And actually we were, in a certain way, this is kind of really a direct application of the Dutch landscape to this kind of situation. But we worked on it kind of really passionately as an expression of kind of maximum socialism. And of course, at the time, we didn't know that socialism was a kind of finite condition. But during the competition, it became clear that the Maurois government was in trouble. Mitterrand appointed a different prime minister, so this shift from one political system to another one was already very noticeable in the whole, in the air. But in terms of endorsement, it was a kind of project of sheer endorsement and deep engagement, particularly with the political dimension of the project.
Now, on a completely other level, the level of representation concerning this project, I think the graphical appearance is really striking, and it's almost the appearance of a cartoon. I was wondering, how many types of drawings did you do in the office for these kinds of projects? Because it looks like a continuous visual research apart from the client, apart from the deadline, was ongoing.
Yeah. Well, I think this is kind of really the beginning of mentality where, you know, underlying some of the best projects or some of the more ambitious projects, there's also methodological kind of ambition. And so therefore, these series of diagrams and their text together were one form of the statement that represented its kind of intellectual essence. And then we kind of separated the other kind of series of obligations, illustration, in a completely different way. Sometimes, and try to be as appealing as possible. So here, we try to be as precise as possible, here as appealing as possible. And so definitely some of these were made to go beyond the language of architecture, because that was another constant theme of the 80s, to remove ourselves outside of the architectural world.
Why?
Because I found it claustrophobic to be inside the architecture world. And I think it was also basically, I think, having had a different profession once, a constant openness to other professions.
Did it also happen that you, in the practice, made these drawings afterwards?
Oh, afterwards, yeah,
yes.
Many times.
Okay.
Yeah.
And was that just for fun, or just to have something for the future?
No, it was. I think a competition is a kind of very weird thing, because it's defined by other people. The timing is defined. The rules are defined. The kind of judgment is defined. So it's and it's something that on which you have kind of very little influence. for instance, it's also defined what you have to produce. So in many cases, we felt that those definitions were not enough to really go to the essence of the project, so we would continue. And that is, of course, one way of looking at architecture that we cultivated at that time. We do not want to be dictated by other people in terms of what we have to say or do, which eventually kind of led to the creation of AMO. We needed to create a kind of platform of counter initiative to do justice to the complexities.
This is another project for France, Paris, from 1987, also a competition, I think, for a Ville Nouvelle in Milan-Senard. And this is, by the way, another quite creative representation of the project. There are, as a matter of fact, quite a lot of these collages in the OMA archives. This is the model. And the concept of the project is that you, instead of building a Ville Nouvelle, is you decide to sort of concentrate the empty spots.
Well, I
and
think
keep them.
I take the risk of sounding like a broken record, but if you compare these two competitions, you've seen the kind of shift from one condition to another in its pure form. Only 7 years between them, or 5, or so like 5, 6. Basically, at this point in the 80s, we kind of realized that a number of the traditional ways of controlling architecture that had been at the disposal of architects, kind of even in the 60s and 70s, you could be sure, for instance, that you could make an urban plan and that the kind of ultimate plan would look relatively like what you designed. Basically, as the 80s went along and as the kind of influence of the market kind of made itself felt, as the developer appeared on the scene with all their kind of preoccupations, but also all their kind of taste, culture, all their interest in different, in the consumer rather than the inhabitant, it became clear that architecture needed to go through a kind of drastic form of adjustment, and that therefore, and that is the case here, that therefore architecture needed to look at other forms that could structure, or other ways you could in the future, given this new lack of control, you could find other ways of nevertheless more or less managing a large territory. So what we try to do here is basically focus on the landscape as the essence of this city. And here the red are two kind of big forests, which we turned red to already indicate that we were reversing the kind of reading and were basically seeing a forest as built. And then there were a series of smaller forests in between, so we decided to keep, for instance, a forest band. Here, this was the trajectory of motorway, so that also was a kind of landscape feature. This was the line of the TGV, which we also kept as a landscape feature. So anyway, we created a kind of Chinese figure of landscape and made that the essence of the city, and then said that kind of basically any developer, and that is what the macaroni kind of represents, any developer could kind of do what they wanted on those islands. And if you look at Almere kind of now, or other cities, you can kind of see that that was exactly what happened, or what would happen later in the kind of 80s and 90s, and that a strategy like this one of finding, looking at other in other domains or other forms of culture, that was simply a necessity to deal with this condition, with an emerging condition. And maybe that is also, maybe in '85, I made a statement that later has come back many times to haunt me. I basically said that architecture needed to deal with the kind of new forces of the market economy, like a surfer on a surfboard. And basically that has many times been kind of read as me endorsing the kind of arrival of neoliberalism with a kind of cynical glee, simply because it was kind of playtime for everybody. It was more a kind of cry for help, kind of suggesting that the market economy was a kind of tsunami, and that the architect, kind of fragile position on a surfboard, needed to find new ways of dealing with that tsunami. And this was one of them.
This is a project I think that started also at the beginning of the 80s, but was finished in 1987. One of the remarkable things about the design is that it seems as if this building in many ways tries not to be a building. I mean, as one sort of identifiable object. This has to do with, again, these are collages, but the facades are in a way composed or non-composed, as in this kind of collage. And even in this kind of picture, it almost disappears, or it becomes difficult to say where the building begins and where it ends. Was there a sort of clear intention in making a building that almost seems to disappear in the cityscape?
Yes. I think that you may not even know that actually it's two buildings. Yeah? This is concert hall, which was done by one architect. Then there was a line of demarcation, and this is the kind of dance theater that was kind of abutting, and the two of us were forced to make a single building. Very interesting, but in the end, through the kind of position of the other party, it did not really amount to an enthusiastic collaboration. Essentially, this kind of thing started by a client who told us, can you do a building for 500 guilders per meter cube? So it was, an incredibly cheap question and a kind of very cheap kind of point of departure. And therefore it was kind of really an almost impossible kind of effort, because it was a huge building with a huge ambition, but literally almost no money. And that was then the kind of first project where we really tried to kind of work within poverty, because I actually find it kind of extremely interesting to have poor budgets, because it kind of forces a kind of real discipline that, for instance, later in the decade we also applied in Congrexpo in Lille, where we kind of felt, we were building a building that you could also build in Calcutta. And in a certain way, this is one of those buildings where cheapness became the essence. And do you have that scene somewhere?
I think.
And so it's a kind of building where we had to be very strategic, and where therefore the kind of work on the ceiling itself with the Polish engineer Stefan Poloni became the kind of main focus of all the efforts almost. It is a kind of Gaudi-esque void where we kind of used the kind of cheapest material, kind of metal decking, to create a double vaulted kind of situation, which is also kind of very smart structural solution for covering an enormous auditorium. So in that sense, I would say I'm kind of really incredibly happy that, you know, I was intimately involved with many postmodernists, because a kind of project like this, I could never have done it without, you know, understanding what postmodernism was about, i.e. applying science kind of on sheds. This falls entirely in the kind of Venturi canon. Yeah. And I'm kind of really proud of that, that that we've had the versatility to also explore that side.
So in a way, it really embraces.
And of course,
yeah.
Sorry, one more thing.
Yeah.
And here, of course, this billboard of Madame President was the overt acknowledgement of that whole position.
Yeah. So it's yeah. Okay. Another.
Just an anecdote.
Mm-hmm.
I've been lucky that that first decade really had very negative press reviews. The Volkskrant, the day after it opened, have you ever read that review? Opened, we all know them. You come in a cafe and you see a kind of guy sitting alone on a table. People whisper, he's drunk, he's the poet, he's lost it, blah, blah, blah. The dance theater was the definitive proof that I had lost it, according to the Volkskrant then at the beginning.
But it will be demolished quite soon, and so it seems the public did not really embrace it in a proper way, because it didn't really evoke a discussion or a debate. I think.
You suggest that the auditorium is the most valuable part of the building, and is that the thing you regret that is going to disappear?
I don't. Basically, if I would kind of invest in regret, then I think that is a very conservative position. So I've decided never to regret anything. So this is kind of simply a sign of the times. And I would not, I disagree with you slightly that this means that the public doesn't embrace it. Mm-hmm. I would say the kind of intellectual world of the Netherlands is oblivious to this as an issue. Yeah? Should you kind of eliminate something that kind of in retrospect might have a kind of certain value as being a work of A, B, or C? So it's not a kind of public thing, but I think it's an indication of a, how shall I say it, of the present state of the cultural sector. And therefore, who am I to regret that?
But in a sense, this evolution shows that there is almost no cultural value attributed to architecture, you could say. Because if it was, then people would...
Well, but maybe it's also kind of asking too much, and because it is an incredibly cheap building, and kind of and the building itself emanates a certain doubt about architectural value. It's also kind of saying, okay, I put a billboard on because the rest is kind of almost nothing. So in that sense, and I've also argued in kind of writing and in different kind of situations that we don't build monuments or don't build kind of things with a definitive quality or monumentality that generations before us did. And that is, I think, also an outcome of the market economy, that everything is defined by a financial envelope that sooner or later expires. So I think we need to kind of really, discuss this in a kind of wider context. So I definitely don't see myself as a kind of victim of this development.
Okay. This is actually a building or a project that was developed very close to the Danstheater at the Spa in The Hague. And if I'm correct, this was the very first competition in the Netherlands where architects were, a public competition where architects were asked to submit a project together with a developer. Yeah. You could say that, well, maybe that is also present in the design. I mean, it almost is a sort of, or is it present in the design? Let me ask it that way.
Yeah. What other? Yeah, I think for me the interesting thing was, you have to know that Holland is addicted to kind of very narrow kind of topology of offices, kind of 12 meters or 14 meters. And that topology kind of implies almost always kind of cellular offices and a corridor in the middle. And basically, at that point in the 80s, it was crystal clear that work in the future would change, that we would need kind of much bigger floor plates, and that basically times were changing, and that this kind of isolated work in a kind of single place was leading to either bureaucracy or lack of interaction, or I mean, you can do the math. So what is interesting about this kind of project is that we needed to find on that basis, which was actually specified as part of the competition, these narrow slabs. We found by having 3 plates that different silhouettes, the possibility of combining plates so that you would have a much greater variety of floor plates that can really anticipate the current wisdom of having kind of deep plates where kind of processes can happen. So that is one of the main arguments behind the kind of project. And you know, in retrospect, I think it's kind of much too American. But there is one kind of representation where the whole thing is kind of represented as a solid, white solid, and then you begin to see some of the kind of sculptural qualities that kind of probably are coming to the fore also in the kind of 80s, in the late 80s. The kind of obligation for architects to produce sculptures and to, in a way, separate the kind of functionalism from shape in a pretty radical way. So again, you could say there's an announcement of a change in architecture through this building.
And talking again about representation, if I see this image of the charcoal drawing, we're now in the era of renderings. How could you help us a bit how this was perceived in that on that moment of time in time? Was this just a stage in again in a showing the research, or
this was a sketch we made ourselves, and I think that most of the renderings were part of which was this rendering particularly, part of a very large kind of painting that in a very painstaking way kind of represents the situation in The Hague as it was then, with extreme neutrality. Also shows the kind of new Tweede Kamer. Objectivity, I would say. This was part of an exhibition that we all had to organize in the Haagse Gemeentemuseum. So there was a kind of public dimension. The public had to vote, and therefore we made elements that were more traditional in their representation, like this one.
But if I compare it to current, to the current state of representation, where renderings are made photorealistic, and I would compare it to this visual language, what would you wouldn't call this a loss, I assume, because you don't have regret, so you would not miss it.
Do I miss this, or do I not miss it?
Do you miss the showing a part of the research you are doing?
Yes, I think that I don't know whether you're too discreet to say it yourself, but if you mean that currently renderings give extremely limited representation of what architecture
what
can
I
be,
mean,
I would
yes.
wholeheartedly agree with you.
Yeah.
And if you see some of the development of our current renderings, we're deliberately trying to move away from that and reassert the importance of other ideas of representation than simply this is how it looks. Yeah?
Well, to be very practical, we need to stop around 9. We still give the audience the opportunity to ask some questions, but we have here gathered different projects. I don't know if there are...
Why don't you skip this one? Because
this one?
to say about
Okay.
No, it's a project I really like, or
Yeah.
if you have a kind of
No?
urgent question,
We can-
or a relevant question.
Why do you
Of
like
course.
it? Why do you like it?
Well, basically, houses are, of course, really private are projects where you can really pursue your private or need to pursue your most intimate preoccupations. And this one was no exception. It's a house in Rotterdam, and there, what I've always been, for instance, and this is a kind of intimate declaration that I think I've never made before, but each architect has also kind of personal challenges that are starting with why. In this case, why do entrances always have to be at the perimeter of a project? I.e., why are they always on the perimeter and never in the center? And I've tried to imagine a few projects where you actually entered in the middle, and maybe the Kunsthal is no exception, because in its original kind of condition, you enter in the middle. And I was extremely proud of that ingenious mutation that I think deserves to be recorded in architectural history, because there is not a single building that where you can say that. And this is a kind of prototype because you enter it in the kind of the house in the kind of center of the house.
Okay. This is a project that is very close to where we are, or for a location very close to where we are now. So we are here. Well, not in this. We are in the second version of this building, and this was the project of OMA for the Netherlands Architecture Institute. Maybe it's more interesting to talk about the Kunsthal and the two versions that exist of it. So just to, who's interested in this project can read the issue of Oase. But it is striking that, to my knowledge, there is no other OMA project that has such clearly defined two different versions. So this is the first version of first project for the Kunsthal made, I think, starting in 87. And then in 89 or 90, 1990, there was a second project, which is the building we are in now. If I'm correct, you've given different reasons for the shift in between these two versions. And one of them, you once stated in an interview that it was because OMA did not win the competition for the Netherlands Architecture Institute, so there was the necessity of a different kind of building on the other end of the museum park. So the largest shift is a sort of, well, you could say sort of change in a very more almost transgressive complexity that is in the building, present in the building where we are now, while this first version seems to be, well, maybe a bit more boring, to put it that way.
You said brutal first and now boring. In doing so, you kind of really illustrate exactly some of the repertoire that I've been systematically and deliberately developing. I think that there are kind of cases where boring kind of makes a lot of sense, or in a degree of brutality. But yes, you're right. We were. We don't have to go back maybe all the way, but anyway, in this situation, initially the Architecture Museum was kind of anticipated here next to Boijmans. And I thought that was a bit primitive. And so with the then wethouder Lindhorst, who asked us to look at the kind of implantation of the Architecture Institute, we defined the current location. And here we had the Kunsthal, which had to be kind of almost mechanical and almost primitive box where any art could be shown in a kind of really efficient way. And so when we were working on this seemed to be a kind of intelligent complement. And when we lost it, we really were happy. We really felt ourselves that we needed to do something kind of more complex. And then we were confronted, as we have been many times, by a client, the interim director, Wim van Kempen, who basically hated this. And therefore, he gave us on a plate the opportunity to do something totally different. And therefore, thanks to Wim van Kempen, we had the opportunity to do the current version. And there, the current version was also part of a kind of agenda of where can you invent. That was important during this decade, and of course in later decades too. But for instance, the kind of building where you enter in the center was one of those themes or intuitions that I had that kind of could lead to something really fantastic. And in this case, there was a similar intuition. Why do kind of floors always have to be on top of each other, and why is any kind of building a first floor, second floor, third floor, and is that really necessary? And so that in such a simple question, which is entertained in many kind of different forms, and that begins with a kind of unconscious feeling that something could be kind of redefined or needs to be redefined, led kind of finally to the Kunsthal. So I would say that the 80s, in spite of how primitive some of the kind of architecture is, the idea of whether a city can be defined by other than built substance, whether a building always have to consist of one floor, two, floor three, whether a building needs to be entered from the outside or can be entered from the inside. Those are some of the themes that enabled us then also to make a serious effort to distance ourselves from our original sources of inspiration.
So the Patteeuw villa in that perspective was a test case, and I think that the Paris villa de Lava was developed in between the two versions. Am I right? Was that also an influence? Was that also, no?
Influence on what?
Well, if I compare the two versions, then I would say indeed that the last version of the Kunsthal is more adventurous.
Okay, yeah.
And I would say that the Villa de Lava contains some of these adventurous ingredients already.
Well, yes. But I think there is something, sorry, yeah. There's something which you see here, which is a kind of ramp that could be retreat into the building, and so there is kind of you see this gray thing. This is kind of something that an entity which we called maybe the kind of robot that could assume many identities, and each time it was different. It could be a whole, or each time it was different, it would kind of influence the entire perimeter of the project. So it's more that there's a different level of adventure there that kind of, for instance, eventually led to the house in Bordeaux with a kind of elevator that again kind of moved up and down mechanically, but and that you could read this as another intuition that we are entering a kind of a moment of robots and of mechanization. That mechanization has always been interpreted on a kind of very simplistic level in architecture. You have a kitchen or a bathroom that is about as technical as it gets, maybe an elevator, but that in the future we are facing a kind of much more hybrid conditions. And I think if you look at Singapore, for instance, you see it happening where buildings are partly machines, slaughterhouses, for instance, that kind of need pockets of human activity and inhabitations, but are ultimately really kind of radically different from anything that the 20th century produced. So you could say it's an anticipation of that condition.
Okay, I think we really need to give, as they say, the floor to the audience. We had prepared some more projects, but maybe the audience will be so kind to ask questions about these projects. Also this one, which you could say is really emblematic for a whole series of projects at the end of the first decade, in the sense that they, what you described as, they sort of embody the persistent desire for collectivity. And then there's we have some photographs from actually the exhibition that gave the title to our issue in also close to this place, the Boijmans van Beuningen, First Decade.
Yeah, I would like to say something. My own feeling, and that is how intimately intertwined the projects are with politics and with the economy. So I've been kind of being quite explicit about how the emerging force of the market economy made its presence felt in many of the projects, and how some of the projects are kind of really explorations, what that implies for architecture and how architecture needs to be kind of reinvented to deal with them. At the end of the 80s, of course, the wall fell, and eventually Russia, the Soviet Union disappeared, and Europe kind of emerged as a kind of entity. And each of these kind of projects, the very big library, the kind of museum in Karlsruhe, and this one, were kind of celebrating those events. And it was a moment that is literally unimaginable today, where we are kind of shamed every day in terms of Europe's reluctance to intervene, reluctance to articulate a vision or an idea. You cannot believe how euphoric that moment was, and how critical it seemed to participate in that euphoria through inventing things rather than kind of repeating things or recycling things. So I would say that there were kind of inventions, and particularly if you look at the very big library, we worked with engineers come from Philips and others, and were kind of particularly interested in finding and defining a relationship between the digital and the real, and where each had their kind of own plausible relationship or autonomy, and where both also had a kind of relationship that was not destructive or simplistic, but actually a form of engagement. If you look at the text of the very big library, you see that we actually use the word tablet for a kind of tablet that enables you to look at films, at books, etc. So we, at that point, really anticipated the kind of situation 25 years later. And what I think is interesting about maybe this whole decade is how every project suggests a kind of naivety and a kind of search and an explicit ambition that was not always coinciding with the ambition of the clients. So there is an independence how every kind of project can be read for an occasion or a trigger to also look kind of beyond that project, look into the future or into the past, as it may be. And in that sense, I was happy with this issue, because it's not necessarily that the issue says that, but for me, kind of looking at it, it kind of really reminded me of all those moments. And therefore, by definition, on a whole series of kind of things that you could see as absences today, or things that are no longer happening. We were talking about, we were surrounded by ideologies that we can relate to. That is kind of much less the case today. But what I think is the most remarkable is the independence of that kind of period, and the independence of how kind of renderings or ideas are represented in ways that are not necessarily and primarily kind of seducing people or giving people a sense of security, but are actually confronting people with kind of perhaps new ways of thinking in a kind of very overt and blatant way. So added to your brutal and other, I would, boring, I would add the word blatant, as characterizing this phase.
Okay, thank you. We have still time for questions from the audience. Yes.
There's a microphone coming at you.
I'm curious if there's any structure in your working week, and how does a working week look like?
Working week?
Yeah.
Basically, I don't want to kind of, yes, there is a structure. I'm not going to share what it looks like. It has a careful kind of division between private and professional activities, and it is geared to invest ideas in projects at the appropriate moment, But I don't want to talk in that sense about myself.
Maybe you can tell us if the structure has changed since the first decade.
Of course, it's changed enormously. I mean, the scale of our buildings has changed. The complexity has changed. The speed of our buildings has changed. The kind of range of the topology has changed, and the kind of countries has multiplied. So all of those are multiplications that clearly create kind of serious issues of how to maintain qualities or kind of integrity or whatever. So yes, it's a constant change.
I have a question. It's maybe hard in this day and age not to fetishize the kind of form of representation of your work, and you spoke about it at the end once again. So my question is, which is the most influential aspect of these projects from the early years? Is it the representation, or is it the design concept, or is it the realized building?
But how do you mean influential? Because I'm not I cannot judge influential.
Within the office, within the office.
I also cannot kind of really answer that question, kind of, because for me, let's say maybe, let's not kind of use that word. For me, the critical idea is that the best projects of this period contain vigorous and original ideas how to deal with a kind of situation which is constantly evolving, and how to anticipate kind of forces that will have a big influence on architecture. So you could say, you know, each of them is a kind of constant questioning of architecture and how it needs to be kind of revised or modernized. Now, for that, you know, kind of privately, speaking as an intellectual, I would say, therefore, the written reports or the diagrams are the kind of most important. But speaking as a kind of artist, I would say kind of some of the kind of renderings are the most important. Speaking as an architect, I would say kind of some of the kind of realizations are the most important. So the word most makes me typically already nervous.
Hello. In your Parisian projects of that decade, it seems that the notion of the void is very, very important. For example, you've mentioned that the Parc de la Villette showed to us what the void of the Green Archipelago could be. And of course, the Très Grande Bibliothèque and Meloensenaar are even more obvious. So I wanted to ask you about your relation to the city of Paris, and why, for you, was this the right context to test your concepts about the void? And why eventually, at the beginning of the next decade, in the 90s, you stopped using that term?
Oh, I think that's a very good comment or insight. And so there's a number of kind of responses. First of all, and I would say that without any doubt, kind of Paris has received not only a colossal amount of architectural intention and investment on our part, but also without any doubt it's been the kind of fertile inspiration for some of our best projects. And that was kind of the reason for that is twofold. There's a triple reason. First of all, the city of Paris and the French state organized a number of competitions that were all exceptionally ambitious and all exceptionally kind of pregnant in terms of raising new issues. So that made it almost totally attractive to participate, but also inevitable to invent a number of breakthroughs. The second one is, you know, for an architect like us, the very solidity of the kind of Paris texture and the very perfection of the city and the admirable way in which the kind of French have maintained that perfection made it also, in terms of a canvas or a context, the kind of most pregnant or eloquent demonstration or laboratory for what we had to propose in terms of kind of radicalism. Also because it is a city that, you know, has kind of received and rejected kind of radicalism almost constantly. And the third one, and that is perhaps also in terms of missing, what is missing today is the sheer fact that through my education alone, I was kind of lucky to learn French and to speak French. And therefore, my entire kind of professional life and my entire student life has been deeply influenced and deeply engaged with kind of French culture. And I would say that my entire mentality, sensibility, and insight is kind of to a very large extent defined by French, by the French, and by communication with France. So to some extent, I could say, you know, that I'm a French architect. And what I've just gave 2 days ago, opened the academic year in the university in Twente, and one of the things we kind of documented is how radically the knowledge of French, German, and other languages except English are declining in our culture. And I would say that that's a complete disaster for the depth or lack of depth that implies. It's kind of like computer renderings. You know, if this kind of English that we all speak is really becoming a norm, it erases kind of vast territories of kind of potential communication and insight with all our complicitness. And by the way, the same is true for German, of course, and for other languages.
I had a question about something you haven't really talked about. It's the use of materials, because when I saw the exhibition here at the Kunsthal, it was all very much about materials, and I was wondering to what extent discovering, experimenting with different kinds of materials was important in the first decade, and what it contributed to giving meaning to the buildings, or that's probably...
Yes. Basically, during this decade, there was a kind of another insight that kind of played a big role. On the one hand, Holland is exceptionally reluctant to invest in the cost of building, and so therefore, almost by definition, the kind of repertoire of materials is extremely poor. And at the same time, in the profession of architecture, there's a kind of fetishism of detailing, which problematizes kind of almost every encounter in architecture, a roof line with a glass plate and a kind of floor, and a lot of, I would say, professional professional angst has kind of, at the time of the 80s, got shifted from conceiving architecture to detailing. And so I was confronted with two things at the same time. No budget for kind of really exploring detail, and at the same time a fetishism of detail that I thought was actually not very positive, but almost negative in terms of, you know, what its effect on architecture was. So the initial experimentation with detail was with cheap materials and their ability and capacity to give a new meaning and new elan to buildings. I would say that and of course also new beauty. Kind of here you have kind of basically opaque, translucent material, and if the elevator moves, it's kind of very beautiful kind of event. Although the profession is indoctrinated to kind of reject the material, but also consider this kind of bad detailing. So there was a kind of struggle on a professional level on what to establish another way of detailing as eventually good detailing, and at the same time a deliberate exploration of a new generation or a new category of materials that could be applied and could be legitimized as architecture.
I wanted to go back to...
and I would say there's something kind of really very, very strange, because there is no fundamental difference in the kind of way, for instance, the kind of Patteeuw Foundation is detailed now, and what we have here, it's simply maybe on the level of cost, and certainly in Patteeuw we detail well, and here we detail badly. So it's also kind of flipped and part of a kind of social perception.
You mentioned in the beginning of the discussion that one way of being open or escaping from the claustrophobia of the architectural scene was having another profession. You were a scriptwriter before, and maybe that relates also to the influence of French culture and French literature. So I would expect that in this first decade there was a lot of underlying maybe influence from literature, from writing in your way of working. And responding to Christophe's question to maybe highlight or speak about some of the projects that were not discussed, maybe you could say something about this very project in Zeebrugge and in which way this literary or scriptive approach was present.
I think we were really in this decade kind of struggling with becoming an architect, and I think that really determined everything. And there were kind of many collaborations, but the most critical collaboration was not with kind of writers and others, but was with engineers. I already mentioned the collaboration with Poloni in the roof of the dance theater. Basically midway in the 80s, I started working with Cecil Balmond, a Sri Lankan engineer, and basically I think the kind of repertoire and the kind of thinking we developed together enabled us me to discover a totally different field from the typical formalistic kind of modernist architecture, and to use structure as one of the ways in which we could think things in a different way and start introduce a kind of newness or perhaps invention. It's only in the next decade when Chris Derkon was director of Boijmans and when Hans Oberst was here every week, and where we had a kind of weekly dinner in Rotterdam, that all the other kind of influences of different domains became explicit as part of the office. And so I would say this decade is kind of really purely dedicated to try to become an architect and to learn on the job, to try to define where things could be invented, to try to separate the connections, two obvious connections of early modernity, and to create a kind of basis of a position, but not necessarily with literature. That came later. I think it's a very good question, and what it kind of shows is that, and maybe that is also kind of important kind of thing to address. In our work and in my writings, I'm kind of exploring many kind of contemporary dilemmas, issues, and of course, I'm kind of very critical of many kind of different phenomena. But as an architect, I'm a kind of very traditional architect in many ways, and you know, deeply kind of at the core of. And it's funny that you call this an intimate question, because it's it's really the essence, and it's kind of bizarre that the essence, you know, becomes an intimate question. But at the core, there is a kind of still, or probably a kind of very traditional concern with with encounters, with collectivity, with assemblies, with creating inspiring environments, and with creating happiness even, or adventure. So in that sense, there is kind of many different motivations, but yes, at the core there is a lot of that, or a lot of that.
I have a question. Maybe this will be even more intimate, actually. So, is there something or someone, like in the past it was modernism for you, and is there something now that in particular inspires you? So basically, what inspires you now?
This is also, I mean, I would say if you look at her work, then you, first of all, we are basically extremely inspired by the current complexity of the world.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm here on your right. I have a question about OMA. Actually, OMA has developed with a very rich and constantly changing, let's say, repertoire of political systems. So,
repertoire of what?
Of different political systems. So, the end of socialism, the start of neoliberalism, and the current market of economy. And this is also obvious in the portfolio if we consider like projects like the Iplein and the Rothschild Bank and the CCTV building. So my question is there a certain period that OMA, as we considered as a comfort zone of the OMA, having been working in such different conditions? And actually the second part of the question is actually when you're inspired actually by Soviet avant-gardism, which had a clear social mission. How do you see the situation now when the market of economy, let's say, rules?
Well, so I've basically tried this kind of evening to show how each architectural project is to some extent dependent on the context. An increasingly important part of the context is economy, and on the other hand, politics. I think that in the 90s there was perhaps an expectation that the kind of world would in the near future become kind of much more homogeneous, and one kind of system would establish itself, and people would be living happily ever after. But I think that what we're seeing now is the complete contradiction of that model, and a very strong presence of many different either religious or political kind of environments that each again have their own kind of relationship to architecture, from complete destruction to using it as a kind of tool for kind of triumphalism or as a tool for marketing, blah, blah, blah. So, as I said, it's that increasing complexity that continues to provoke us or inspire us to constantly again think of appropriate ways of living in those conditions and of establishing appropriate relationships with systems that are very different from our own and in certain cases very alien to us. But just as I'm interested in kind of producing an architecture that connects or relates to history, I'm also interested in architecture as a kind of form of communication. So for that reason, I remain committed to exploring that diversity.
Okay, I think maybe there's time for one last question.
Thank you. I want to ask, it's like a practical question for the young architect. So how was your life? How was your life as the beginner startup designer at the First Decade? So how many colleagues, and then how was your salary or whatever, how was the financial situation as a startup designer at the First Decade?
I think that, and this is why I can make a comparison with Björke. What you've seen is kind of 10 years of kind of struggle, not so much economic struggle, although that was also an important struggle, but 10 years of wrestling with issues and 10 years of sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding, sometimes kind of in between. And basically, I think before that, the decades before that you call the zero decade, was different. It was a kind of 10 years period of investigation and speculation and kind of working on hypotheses. So I would say that the lesson of my life is maybe, to encourage you to waste a lot of time and in many different directions, because I think the history of, or the point of my so-called career is really that it's based on the kind of period where I was not an architect and took the freedom to waste time and to prepare in a certain way. And I feel that kind of many current generations, this kind of wasting time is cut out, and that there's an immediate anxiety to start. So I would kind of encourage you to postpone the moment of start. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for this last advice. There's one more statement from Ilko.
Yeah. So I'm just going to conclude very briefly. Thank you, Rem. Thank you, Job, and thank you, Christophe. Thank you all. Well, before we head off for drinks, I'm just going to thank some people and institutions that made this evening possible. Of course, I want to give a big compliment to the entire Oase team, but especially to the editors, Christophe van Gerrewey and Véronique Patteeuw, for conceiving and realizing the issue and for preparing this evening. Of course, I thank Rem for taking up the offer from the Oase editors and be here tonight. Thank the OMA team for making it happen. Also, for the production team of the issue, a lot of people worked on this, so I'm obviously forgetting a lot of them, but I hope that they will allow me to mention just Barbara van Kooi, who was with the microphone, who single-handedly coordinated this evening, and it wasn't even in her job description. So thank you, Barbara. You did a wonderful job. And finally, let me mention to you that Oase, and we owe a lot to our sponsors, many of them who hail from the architectural community, who are actually individual practicing architects. So they make Oase happen. And to the Creative Industry Fund, who has been willing to support Oase on numerous occasions. So let me finish with a plea for support for Oase, because as a journal, I think it has a very valuable position within international architectural discourse, as we have seen tonight. It is independent and explores the domain where academic discourse and architectural practice engage. And even if Oase has fans and is being read around the world, its existence is by no means guaranteed. So whether in print or in digital format, the cost of producing quality in architectural discourse is not necessarily an economically profitable enterprise. Yet these costs are entirely justified if we want to have and foster this quality. So, buy the issue, subscribe at the NAO10 desk, or better still, become a sponsor and feel good about it. Thank you all, and please join me and Rem for a drink in the cafe.